Now in segment 2, we're going to look at, demand, where's demand shifting, what does the supply look like in the U.S. And we'll use some of the demand. Again, when we talk about this and as I try to explain it, like supply is science. You're counting barrels, you're seeing what's in storage. There's a certain amount of art in terms of, what's in transit, what's not, but there's a lot of science, like math behind it, where demand, it's an aggregate. It's more of an art, like what matters more, who's doing what, and trying to pin down a consumer anywhere in the country is very, very difficult because the consumer's fickle. Things are slow, and then all at once, and you don't really know when that all at once happens at the same time because it will fluctuate. But those are things that we try to just give you some guidance of what are we seeing, what are we thinking, and where do we see this going from here. So now when we start looking at U.S. products supplied, you can see that there's been that big dip. Now we're, so this current week, and again, this is finished motor gasoline, jet fuel, distillate, resid, we're at just below 14 million barrels of demand. We are at 13.996 million barrels of demand. So you can kind of see that we're just below, almost right in line with the average for 2021. But then the last week, the week that we weren't here, it was 13.868. So you see that, again, that big drop. And that's what we've been talking about, where instead of going up, now, again, it's going to fluctuate back and forth. It's not going to be, we should get a bounce, especially on distillate and gasoline. But it's just we're not seeing that normal kind of increase that we typically have. And that's something that we think persists. Is that when you look at price is prohibitive. Now, there's a certain amount of inelasticity because you still have to get to work, you still have to get to the store, you still have to do things. It's just, how do I do less of it? And when you look at working from home, instead of working from home because of COVID, you're working from home because it's expensive to get to work. You're trying to minimize how often am I traveling, how often am I going somewhere, to again preserve some of those additional barrels. And then on the distillate side, we're coming into a sluggish period just with heating coming to an end, and then at the same time you have that kind of that trucking. I don't want to say just it's a standstill. No one really wants to pay the elevated prices. They have some excess inventory. Consumers slowing a bit, so I'm going to give it a moment to let this kind of digest and see if prices come down a bit. Lumber, just taking an example, just because the headline just came across, lumber fell to an exchange limit, which is just limit down, $881 per contract. Still, when you zoom out, still very expensive. But again, that softness coming in on that on those different levels. So now when we start looking at distillate had a small build of 770,000 barrels. Against the 5-year average, it's still down 21 million. But again, I keep coming back to it. It's really pad 1 that is the driver. When you look at pad 1, had a drop of 1.34 million. That's 15.4 million below the 5-year average. Now, where was Russian diesel coming in? It was coming into the pad 1. Where did the refinery blow up? Philadelphia. So you get a lot of these problems are very specific to the East Coast, as everything else throughout the U.S. is fairly stable. Pad 2 had a small build, 1.7 below the 5-year. Pad 3, 3.7 below the 5-year. But then the other two right in line. So again, it's how do we get it from where it currently sits and resides, which there's some excess in Pad 2, Pad 3. Colonial Pipeline is tapped out, and you still have the Jones Act, so it's still really expensive to get it over. So here, is this something where you have Pad 3 exporting into Europe, and then Europe exporting into Pad 1, and again increasing miles per ton and creating the inefficiencies that we all know and love when you look at politics and policy getting in the way of a more balanced market. On the import side, you can see the imports dropped 100,000 barrels, 67,000 barrels a day. That's 100,000 below the 5-year, and the dip came in Pad 1. That's going to kind of ebb and flow. Pad 5 is going to be the interesting one because we do expect Pad 5 to see a steady increase as some of those additional cargoes come this way. It's just going to be a matter of, when do they come through, how quickly. When you look at some of these shipments, so there's been a provisional booking uptick in gasoline shipments. We'll talk about that in a minute. But on Pad 1, we should start to see some of those additional into the East Coast. Now, when you look at the storage in general, clearly we're still very low. We're still well below the 29-year average, but we're starting to pivot back up. And one of the things that we were saying before, obviously we weren't here last week, but the week before, was that we were starting to see it flatline. And it was just, we were starting to see it kind of gradually go down, and we did expect to see a little bit of an increase. And again, it's the rate of change. The rate of change slowed more than seasonal norms, and we expect the rate of change to increase just a bit to get us a bit closer to that 29-year average. It's going to be slow, and the delta is really going to be trucking. How quickly does trucking pick back up? Does it pick back up? And that's going to, again, kind of dictate how quickly do we get back and make up some of those levels. When we look at demand, you can see that there was a big drop in demand last week, and then another one now. It's actually the lowest demand for 2022. So just to preface that, that's not overly shocking, just because we've seen these kind of overshoots back and forth. You had heating demand coming down, you had trucking demand slowing, so that kind of makes sense. But we do expect this to come up. The difference now was, for those that have been following us, our view was that you were going to either be at the highs, right at that top end, and the lowest point was going to be the 5-year average. Now we're seeing that kind of flip on its head, and the high point will be just above the 5-year average, and we do expect to see some of these low points in the near term as trucking demand is slowing a bit, and you're coming out of heating season. Now, when we look at some of the market demand here, you can the load availability is kind of flatlined. So there's still the availability, but are they willing to pay the going rate? And you've seen here, when you start looking at refrigerated rates, rates are coming down a bit. They're trying to find some of these levels, and the rates right now just don't cover diesel and labor. So you have the buyer, or the person on the back end that would be contracting the truck, saying we don't need it, and then you have that company saying, well, this is the rate I'll pay, and the trucking company's like, no, I'll just sit here. And so that's when you're going to start to see a bit more contract, a bit less of spot, and trying to, again, kind of balance this point. So one of the things that we were expecting is kind of that 145 to 155 and kind of bouncing back and forth. We're going to re-rate that lower, and we're going to show you why in a minute. And I think the Freight Waves team has done a great job of kind of highlighting the problems and where we're going to get some of that overhang, which is why we're pulling this a bit down. And we do see some downward momentum towards the index of about 110. Obviously, when you zoom out, still a lot of trucking demand versus historics. It's not what was expected. And it's obviously well off of 2021 and 2022 highs with a bit more down move. And we're probably going to come to that low end that we saw in 2021 and kind of hang out there for a bit as you start to get some of this normalcy and balancing act. Now, on the rail side, the total carloads are up 0.6%. Obviously, coal is going to remain strong. Forest products, farm products are remaining strong. Grains a struggle just because of volume and just some of the things that we're going to talk about in segment 1 of the Econ Show. And then when you start looking at motor vehicle parts, things are starting to catch up a little bit. So you're starting to see that ramp. And then when you start looking at petroleum products, maybe they start using trains to move some of this diesel and distillate from pad 3 to pad 1, but so far not so much. And then intermodal continues to be underwhelming. That's just due to congestion. Again, a lot of those issues that are going to remain, that's going to keep intermodal depressed. And even though trucking isn't there, it's just a matter of cost. We keep expecting it to go from truck to train, and we're just not seeing that. And again, we expect to be about 5 to 6% below last year on the intermodal front. Now, just looking at, this was a chart from Freight Waves that I think is really good. And you can just look at outbound tender rejections. And you can just see just the level of rejections and how things are slowing down in every region. Like, there is not a region that is strong. There's regions that are less bad, but they're all just in a significant down move. And again, these rejections are just, people are like, I can't afford that, and I have enough inventory that I don't need to pay these prices. So you're seeing those rejections. So then when you look at the supply chain, inventories are sitting at a record high, not low. And again, record high, relatively speaking. The supply chain moves fast, but so does a bullwhip, which is, I thought it was a funny comment from Craig Fuller from Freight Waves. And the LMI has been flashing red warning lights for about 2 months that a slowdown was imminent. It takes a little bit of time because it's a matter of like, when does that happen? There was, companies were building inventory, but the warnings were there, which is why we kept saying like, look, it's going to come down a bit. This is just a bigger decline than even we were expecting. We were expecting to be a little bit stronger, but clearly here we are, and the pressure continues to mount. Now, I thought these were two interesting charts. The grocery expenditure by state I thought was an interesting backdrop, because a large part of the country sits at about 6% and above. And I think that's a big problem when you start looking at the amount of money that people have to shell out in order to just eat. And this is grocery. This is not eating out. This is feeding your family at home. And as more of your disposable income goes from just, paying bills to, trying to, or I should say discretionary income, that's where it's going to come from, because you have to pay, in theory, you have to pay your bills. You have to pay your bills. You have to maintain, whatever lifestyle you have, from rent, mortgage, car payments, insurance. But then you start to see kind of this slowdown. And that, again, is where we're seeing that. Now, the other interesting piece is the ratio of average hourly earnings to gas prices. And when you look at just where the average hourly earnings, you're seeing again, a lot of money, and the average hourly earnings is almost 7.4 hours to gas prices. Like that's a lot. And I think that as that continues to, I don't want to say worsen, because I think we've seen the peak, but as it kind of stays here, even though this will get a bit better, diesel prices are a bit sticky, and diesel hits everything. And that's why we show the grocery piece mixed in with the gasoline one, because the gasoline one you see, real time. You're putting your credit card in, you're taking it out. But the grocery side, that's the one that diesel is baked into. How are you moving and I think DRW had a great example on watermelon. Where watermelon doesn't grow in November, but yet you can buy watermelon in November if you want it. And how does it get from point A to point B, which is Latin America, to, let's call the East Coast? And again, there's diesel and marine gas oil mixed in all the way through, and that all adds up, which again keeps that grocery expenditure elevated. Now, when you start looking at the recent trends, where high cost of living and inflation is becoming front and center. And as that continues to create that fear, that's where we're going to continue to see people kind of ratcheting down on their spending, because they're like, look, I'm concerned, I'm a bit nervous. And when people are nervous, they tend to do the easiest thing, which is say no and to just pull back. And inflation as most important problem facing the U.S. 17%, just to give you an idea, is, if you look at 18, was in 1983. So again, we're back to the 80s in terms of the amount that this is concerning people. And unfortunately, as we've been saying, that's not going to get any better. So now when we look at Americans' concern about the availability and affordability of energy is at 47%. So unsurprisingly, Americans' concern about energy are rising quickly. The survey shows 47% of respondents are worried about availability and affordability, well off pandemic low and at the highest in a decade. And for those that obviously are Americans worry first and then act. It's not like, well, we're going to worry and act at the same time. This seems bad, but maybe it'll get better. And then as it continues to not get better, but actually get worse, that's when you start to kind of see that drop, which is why it's slowly and then all at once. And that's something that we're seeing here. Now, on the logistics side at the coast, we still see a lot of shipments, but with China kind of shutting down, we do see some of that slowdown, and that's going to be a bit of that overhang that we're talking about, where we will have kind of that quick surge, but then we should see a drop off. And then the question is going to be, how quickly does that drop off, adjust itself? And it's just we're still going to remain very elevated on TEUs, maybe not to 2021 levels, but still elevated versus previous historics, even though we will get a slowdown with shipments from the lockdowns in China. So now here you can see that there's a shift in terms of temperatures. You can still see that things are going to be below or average on the West Coast and in large parts of the Rockies. But then when you start moving towards the Midwest and over to the East Coast, we're going to be above normal. So again, that's going to decrease the amount of natural gas burn. It's going to decrease the amount of heating oil that's going to be consumed. And it's just because it's not really warm enough for air conditioning. It's not really cold enough. And again, that's kind of perfect. That shoulder point, which is where you will continue to see that decline in necessity for heating oil and again diesel in general, given how they're molecularly the same and they compete against each other. So now when you look at gasoline had a drop of 2 million barrels. That's 1.6 million below the 5-year average. But if you kind of peel away 2020, it's pretty much right in line with the 5-year average. I think it's 0.3 or 0.2 below, so 200,000 barrels. So again, right in line. When you look at where the drop is, it's PADD 1. PADD 1 is 6.5 million below the 5-year average, with everything else above, especially PADD 3. PADD 1 had a drop of 1.34 million. So when you look at imports had that drop that we talked about in segment 1. Of 172,000 barrels a day. That's 209,000 below the 5-year average. But we're starting to get a little bit of an increase in the amount of gasoline coming into the market. That will accelerate, and we will see more of that coming through. Again, it'll be below the 5-year average, but it will still see some of that competing because PADD 1 is a natural dumping point for it. When you look at blending components, which I think is a better bellwether of where is demand right now, blending components actually had an increase of 410,000 barrels in storage, which is 3.8 million above the 5-year average. And if you take away 2020, it is at an all-time high, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's when you start looking abroad, China continues to kind of bump sideways. We expect that to remain a bit flat. Then when you look at Europe, Europe has bounced a bit. We expect that to be under a bit of pressure. The Americas, you can see, is a bit reduced in terms of just where things are. Asia Pacific had a nice bounce, but remember, we were coming into Ramadan. Now that we're kind of paring back from Ramadan, from some of that should come back a bit, and we're starting to see some of the pressure points when you start looking at Apple mobility data. You're starting to see some of that roll over. So Americas is down, 4, Asia Pacific. So when you start looking at the different balances, Apple is more about searching. Searches are coming down. Google mobility usually follows it up or down. Sometimes they can deviate, but again, we think that it's just going to kind of stay here and stay just below normal. Now, according to GasBuddy data, the U.S. weekly demand rose 4.7% last week and was 8% above the 4-week rolling average. So we're just not seeing a lot of that translate to miles. And the question will be, are people filling up because they're concerned about what prices will be, and it's not really translating into actual movements? And again, there's a lot of kind of unknowns when you start looking at the gasoline conundrum at this point. Here's prices. So the blue line is diesel. You can kind of see it's just going sideways at this point and flagging. We do think that will have some downward movements, but you can see it's just going sideways, where regular unleaded continues to drift lower. Again, we think it'll drift further to about $4. The problem is, as we get into summer driving season, it's more expensive to make summer gasoline, so they'll get some support, and you'll see that kind of bridge that gap and remain elevated. And here's looking at blending components, again, going sideways. 2020 is that big outlier, but you can see that we're still well above what would be normal for 2021, 2019, 2018, 2017, and 16. We still have a lot of that elevated numbers. This is just looking at demand over the last 10 years. You can see that the only time we had lower demand was obviously in 2020, but also in 2013. So you're seeing that bump along the bottom. We do expect this to come back up, but still remain well off normal pace and well below what is seasonally normal. And here's when you start looking at why. The residential remains elevated, workplace and has remained kind of flat. Again, people not going in. for COVID, but not now. It's because of gasoline prices and not really wanting to travel. And then grocery, pharmacy, and retail recreation have come down. And again, that's just people trying to pare back. Let's make sure we get everything that we need in one trip so we don't have to do an extra and save some of that gasoline. And it doesn't sound like a lot because it's not. But if everybody does that, or if every third American does that, all of a sudden it adds up fairly quickly, which is what we're seeing. Now, Apple mobility trends, again, kind of, that elevate the slowdowns remain mostly in Europe. Things in the U.S. kind of flattish. But again, the European slowdown is the bigger overhang, especially when you start looking in comparatively speaking prices in Europe versus the U.S. Propane had a build of 670,000 barrels. That's still 9.2 million below the 5-year average. But you can see we're now just above 2018 levels. And we expect to kind of bump along that 2018 component. So below 2017, above 2018 as we go through what would be the shoulder month. And days of supply, you can see, again, just above 2018 numbers. We're above the worry point of 20 days of coverage. So again, it'll kind of be a slow grind back up, but demand still remains elevated in the U.S., which will keep that at the low end. Now, when we look at jet fuel had a drop of 700,000 barrels. That's 4.6 million below the 5-year average. And again, right back to the kind of that point of 1.45, 1.5, we just expect it to stay in that 1.4 to 1.4 to 1.55 and just stay kind of in that chevron pattern going sideways as we go through the remainder of, really the remainder of spring and even early summer. So then when we look at TSA passengers, here's why. When you look at the passengers so far, we're still well below 2019 norms. We're maintaining lower highs, lower lows. And we're not going to go to 2020 levels, but just based on price, just based on where we sit, just availability, that's going to continue to be an overhang. And then when you look at 12-week ahead passengers, weeks ahead is about 0.4% lower week on week. So pretty stable, not seeing too much adjustment. We've seen some of it come down, and now we're just, let's just say, holding flat at this point in time, given where we are in the cycle. And then open table, you can see that we've continued to remain a bit elevated, with Australia and Ireland being the biggest drivers. U.S. is kind of bumping along the bottom. Same with Canada. So here on an open table global level, on the weekends we'll probably be about 5 to 10% better, and on the weekdays 0 to 5% better. So you're still seeing some movement, but it's just a bit more muted versus I think what expectations were coming into, and kind of right in line with what we were talking about, where we're just not going to get to that normal seasonal bump, especially off of what expectations were in the market.